Ethan sat in the security office, eyes glued to the flickering screens. The quiet, abandoned mall stretched before him, cold and lifeless. It was supposed to be a routine shift. Yet, as the hours wore on, something in the silence began to change, something he couldn't see, but felt. A shadow. A noise. A presence. The building, long forgotten, seemed to stir, its dark corners whispering secrets Ethan wasn't meant to hear. He had dismissed the warnings about night shifts, about things lurking in the shadows. But now, he was beginning to wonder if the stories might have been true. Ethan sat in the dimly lit security office, staring at the monitor screens that flickered with grainy footage of the mall he had been assigned to guard. It was his first night shift at this isolated, outdated shopping center, and the silence pressed in on him like a thick fog. The mall had been slowly deteriorating over the past few years, a shadow of its former self. The once bustling food court was now abandoned, its neon lights barely hanging on. The stores that lined the main hallway were mostly vacant, with darkened windows reflecting the ghostly glow of the overhead lights. There was an eerie stillness that seemed to haunt every corner. Ethan had always been skeptical of the stories he'd heard about night shifts. "You'll see things," they told him. "Things that can't be explained." But he wasn't one to buy into that. He had grown up in a practical, logical world. Ghosts, spirits, the supernatural, they were all just stories to him. So when he accepted the job as the night security guard, he expected nothing more than the occasional break-in or maybe a raccoon rummaging through the dumpsters. But as the hours stretched on and the mall became more silent, more lifeless, the unease began to creep in. The hum of the security cameras was the only sound breaking the silence. Ethan had learned the layout of the mall well, having walked through it a few times during his shift. It was as though the building itself was quietly watching him, its empty spaces full of secrets he couldn't quite put his finger on. The cameras offered a strange kind of solace, a constant presence in the otherwise empty halls. He stared at the screens, eyes darting from one corner of the mall to another, checking for any signs of movement. At first, everything appeared as it should, empty and quiet. But then, something unusual caught his attention. The camera feed from the second-floor corridor flickered, a brief moment of distortion, before a shadow moved across the frame. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to brush it off. It could have been a trick of the light or some kind of malfunction. But something about it made him uneasy. The shadow was too deliberate, too quick, to be anything other than a person. But there was no one there. Ethan squinted at the screen, hoping to see something that would explain the anomaly, but the hallway was empty. The shadow had vanished. His pulse quickened, but he tried to push the feeling of unease to the back of his mind. "It's just a glitch," he muttered to himself. He glanced at the other cameras, but nothing stood out. Just rows and rows of empty stores and silent hallways. Still, the image of that shadow lingered in the back of his mind, a nagging sensation that he couldn't shake. He stood up from his chair and paced the small office, his eyes still fixed on the screens. Maybe it was time to do a quick walkthrough of the mall, get some fresh air, and clear his head. He grabbed the flashlight from his desk and made his way to the door. As he stepped out into the cold, sterile hallway, the silence pressed in around him once more, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the soft click of his boots on the linoleum floors, echoing off the walls like distant footsteps in a vast, empty world. The mall seemed even more unsettling in person. The flickering lights above him cast long, distorted shadows across the walls, making every corner look like it held something waiting to leap out. He made his way toward the center of the building, scanning the empty spaces as he went. The food court was dark, the tables and chairs abandoned, frozen in time. He paused for a moment, his flashlight beam dancing across the cracked tiles. The air felt colder here, somehow, though it was no different from the rest of the mall. Still, Ethan couldn't help but feel a creeping sensation in the pit of his stomach. He continued his patrol, reaching the far end of the corridor. As he moved through the mall, his mind kept drifting back to the camera feed. The shadow on the screen, it wasn't his imagination, was it? There had to be something more to it. Maybe someone had snuck in, someone trying to get in undetected. But that didn't explain why there had been no sign of life when he checked the area in person. The low hum of the security cameras was a constant presence in his ears as he walked, a reminder of the strange feeling that had begun to settle over him. The deeper he walked into the mall, the more suffocating the silence became. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, and the building itself was watching. Every time he turned a corner, he expected to see something, or someone, standing just out of view, lurking in the shadows. But each time, the hallways remained empty, save for the occasional flicker of light or distant creak of the floor. He rounded another corner, heading back toward the security office, when he heard it, a faint sound, just barely audible over the hum of the cameras. It was a rustling noise, almost like paper crinkling or fabric brushing against the floor. Ethan froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound seemed to come from the storage closet down the hall, a room he had passed countless times without a second thought. He stood there for a moment, listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was gone as quickly as it had started, leaving behind nothing but silence. Shaking his head, Ethan turned back toward the office. "It's probably just the wind or something," he muttered to himself. But even as he walked back, his steps quickening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The feeling that he wasn't alone in this dark, empty mall. He reached the security office and sat down at the desk, his mind racing. He glanced at the screens again. The shadow had reappeared, this time in a different part of the building. It darted across the frame, moving too fast for him to catch a clear glimpse of it. Ethan's stomach dropped. It wasn't a glitch. There was something, or someone. He felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of his neck. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the footage more closely. There, in the corner of the camera feed, a figure moved once again. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was human-shaped, tall, and impossibly still. Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He felt paralyzed by the sight. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Ethan stared at the monitor in disbelief. He grabbed the flashlight again and rushed out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to check the area. He needed to see it for himself. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall as he made his way toward the location he had seen on the monitor. But as he turned the corner, the hallway was empty, just as it had been before. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole as he walked, the light from his flashlight flickering against the walls. He reached the spot where the figure had appeared, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. He stood there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind racing to make sense of what he had seen. Was it a trick of the mind? Or was something truly wrong with the mall? He couldn't explain it, but the nagging feeling that something was watching him wouldn't leave. He had to get to the bottom of this. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he heard the faintest whisper. It was barely audible, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from all around him. Ethan's heart raced. He turned, but there was no one there. No one except him, alone in the dark, with the feeling that the building itself was alive, watching, waiting, and perhaps even feeding on his fear. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, until Ethan could hear it clearly. "You're not alone," it whispered. The words sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't alone. The realization hit him with full force, and his entire body froze. Something was here with him. Something that the cameras couldn't catch, something that only the shadows could see. Ethan's mind was racing as he stood frozen in the middle of the dark hallway. His breath came in shallow, erratic gasps, and his pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the air around him growing colder, the once stale smell of the mall now thick with an unexplainable chill. The whisper had sent a shiver down his spine, and the dread that had been slowly creeping up on him now surged forward in a tidal wave. His skin tingled with the unmistakable feeling of being watched, as if something unseen, something far older than the building itself, had just awoken. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the pale glow of the flickering lights casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls like specters of the past. He turned his flashlight in every direction, half expecting to see something. A figure, a shape, anything, emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing. The darkness felt alive in a way he couldn't comprehend, A living entity pressing down on him, urging him to leave, to run. But where would he go? There was no escape. The mall had swallowed him whole, and now it felt as though it was slowly tightening its grip. Ethan forced himself to take a step, then another. His legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath him was trying to pull him into the depths of the earth. Each step echoed unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence, the sound of his boots on the cold tile floor reverberating through the empty halls. The whispering had stopped, but the sense of impending doom lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. He could feel his mind starting to unravel, his logical, practical self being eaten away by the growing terror gnawing at his insides. He reached for his radio, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the device. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling, unsure whether anyone was even listening. "This is Ethan. Anyone out there?" But the radio only crackled in response, static filling the silence, broken only by the sound of his breath. He tried again, louder this time, desperation creeping into his voice. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" The radio let out a low hum, and for a moment he thought he heard something. A voice, faint and garbled, distant and indistinct. It was hard to make out the words, but there was an unmistakable tone to it, something urgent, something familiar. His heart skipped a beat. Was it the voice from before? The one he'd heard through the static on the radio earlier? He strained to hear, but the sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. Ethan stood there, motionless, staring at the radio in his hand. He could feel the tension building again, like a storm on the horizon, threatening to break. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong, something far beyond the strange shadow he had seen earlier. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable now, and the building, which had once felt so empty, now felt impossibly full, full of ghosts, full of secrets. It was as if it was alive, breathing, pulsing with something malevolent that had been hiding in the dark corners all along. The overhead lights flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Ethan's hand tightened around the flashlight, his fingers numb from the cold. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning every inch of the hallway, but there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence and the feeling that he was being hunted, his every move tracked by something unseen, something ancient. He forced himself to move again, though his body felt like it was made of lead. The faintest sound, a footstep, perhaps, echoed in the distance. His heart lurched, and he turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway remained empty. It was as if the sound had never existed, a figment of his imagination, or maybe something far worse. He took a few more steps, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. There it was again. A noise, louder this time. It was unmistakable, a soft, deliberate footstep. Ethan whipped around, panic rising in his chest. He was alone. He had to be alone. But then another sound. A low groan, coming from the far end of the hall, near the storage area. The sound was deep and unnatural, like a door creaking on old hinges. Ethan's stomach churned, and his skin crawled as the noise seemed to grow louder, closer. He tried to take another step forward, but his legs felt frozen, as if they refused to obey his commands. His mind raced. There was no rational explanation for any of this. The lights flickering, the whispers, the shadows, everything was stacking up in a way that didn't make sense. His logical, grounded self wanted to dismiss it all, to find a rational explanation. But every part of him, every instinct, screamed that he wasn't alone. Something was here. And whatever it wasn't human. Without thinking, Ethan bolted down the hallway, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he ran. His breath was ragged, and the sound of his feet pounding on the floor echoed like thunder in the empty building. He turned a corner, desperate to get back to the security office, desperate to find some form of safety. But as he rounded the corner, the hallway stretched out before him, endless and dark, as though the building had shifted, bending its halls into impossible configurations. He stopped, his chest heaving, and looked around. The familiar hallway was gone. The walls were darker, the shadows deeper. The hum of the security cameras was louder now, almost deafening. and in the distance, he could hear something. A voice. Faint but distinct. Calling his name. Ethan. The voice whispered. His heart skipped a beat. He turned in the direction of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the long, dark stretch of the hallway ahead. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the sound of his name rolling off the walls like a mocking echo. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. There was no way this could be happening. There was no rational explanation for it. He was losing his grip on reality, and the fear clawing at his mind was taking hold. The sound of footsteps, more deliberate now, brought him back to the present. Ethan spun around, shining the flashlight wildly in the direction of the noise. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, slow and methodical, as if someone was drawing closer, step by agonizing step. He took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight flickering as he moved. A faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance, a door, slightly ajar. The flickering light seemed like the only safe haven in the growing darkness. He moved toward it, his mind torn between the need to find an escape and the need to understand what was happening. As he approached the door, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every step. The faint whispers returned, but now they were louder, clearer, their words more distinct. "You can't leave," they whispered. "You'll never leave." Ethan's pulse raced, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by fear. The door loomed ahead, and the whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of terror. He could feel the weight of their words sinking into him, threatening to pull him under. He was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. But then he reached for the door. His hand trembling, his breath shallow and fast, he pushed it open. The darkness beyond was suffocating, like the maw of some ancient beast, waiting to devour him whole. His flashlight barely pierced the blackness. There was nothing visible beyond the threshold, only the deep, unnerving silence. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, and the whispering voices stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The world felt suspended, frozen in time. Then, from the shadows, something stirred. It wasn't human. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he slowly backed into the dark room, his flashlight flickering erratically. The sudden slam of the door behind him had sent his pulse into overdrive. The air was colder now, frigid even, and the darkness in the room seemed to wrap around him, suffocating and thick. His mind raced, his heart pounded with fear and confusion, and yet, in that moment, it felt like everything had gone still, as though the world outside had stopped turning. The whispering had stopped, and that was worse than anything. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him in a way the voices had not. He strained his ears, desperate for any sound, anything at all, but there was nothing. The only noise was the distant hum of the security cameras, their whirring seeming unnaturally loud now. He could feel the presence of the room pressing in on him, as though it was alive. He had crossed a threshold. He could feel it in his bones that there was no going back now. The flashlight in his hand seemed to grow heavier by the second. His grip tightened on it, though his fingers were numb from the cold. The beam danced across the room, revealing little, just the outlines of old furniture covered in dust. Broken chairs, a few scattered boxes, a lone shelf that hadn't been touched in years. It was just like the rest of the mall, forgotten, abandoned, decaying. But something in the room felt different. Something wasn't right. His skin crawled, and his pulse raced as he scanned the corners, looking for movement, for something that could explain the terror gnawing at him. His mind was frantically trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the impossible. The footsteps, the voice, the shadows. What had he seen? Was he just imagining it? He couldn't tell anymore. There was no rational explanation for what was happening, no way to explain away the fear that had settled deep inside him. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the madness. The darkness in the room felt endless, stretching farther than it should, as if the walls had become fluid and malleable. As Ethan took another step back, his foot brushed against something soft, a rug covered in layers of dust. He froze, the sound of his movement so loud in the silence it seemed to echo in his ears. He hadn't expected to find anything in the room, let alone something that could make a noise. The air felt colder still, and his breath came in visible puffs now, the chill wrapping around him like a tightening vice. There was something in the shadows. Something moving. He turned toward the far corner of the room, where the flashlight beam had briefly flickered, but the light didn't reach far enough. The darkness was too thick, too consuming. He could see nothing but the shadows. And yet, he could feel it. The presence. He wasn't alone in the room. It was waiting, watching, maybe even listening to his every move. The silence was the loudest thing now, louder than his breathing, louder than his heart hammering in his chest. Suddenly, the faintest sound broke the silence, the scraping of something across the floor. Ethan whipped his head toward the source of the sound, his flashlight darting frantically around the room. But there was nothing. His breathing quickened. His hands shook so violently that the flashlight wavered in his grip. He couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable, a soft, almost imperceptible dragging, like something, or someone, was crawling just out of sight. His heart skipped a beat, the sound of it in his ears louder than the scraping itself. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice shaky, barely a whisper. He regretted it the moment the words left his mouth. The room seemed to grow even colder, the darkness pressing in on him, heavier, more suffocating. No reply came. Just silence. And then the scraping sound came again, louder this time, closer. Ethan's pulse surged with adrenaline as his eyes darted around the room, trying to locate the source of the noise. He took another step backward, his legs stiff with fear, but the cold floor beneath him seemed to stretch endlessly. The shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the room. He was trapped. His breath hitched when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a shape in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakable. It was there, moving slowly, deliberately. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the shape took form. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline jagged and unnatural. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His body froze. His muscles locked in place, unable to move as the shape moved closer. It didn't make a sound. There were no footsteps, no scraping, no breaths, just the eerie stillness of the room, broken only by Ethan's panicked breathing. The figure didn't walk. It glided, its movements smooth and fluid, like it was drifting through the air rather than walking on the ground. Ethan wanted to scream, but his throat was tight, his mouth dry. His eyes remained fixed on the shape, unable to look away. It felt wrong in every sense of the word, like something that didn't belong, something that was never meant to be here. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was gone. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. He scanned the room desperately, his flashlight sweeping through the air, but there was nothing except the cold, suffocating silence. He felt dizzy, disoriented. Had he imagined it? Was it just another trick of his mind? His eyes strained against the darkness, but it was impossible to make sense of what was real anymore. The room felt different now. It felt tighter, smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Ethan could feel it. Something was pressing against him, making it harder to breathe. The temperature seemed to have dropped even more. He felt his breath condense in the air, the cold seeping into his bones. His entire body shook with fear. He had to get out of there. But just as he turned to make his way toward the door, the scraping sound returned, this time behind him. Ethan spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. He saw it then, just at the edge of the light. A face. A pale, distorted face with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to be frozen in an eternal scream. It wasn't human, not anymore. The eyes, empty, devoid of any emotion, stared right at him, and the room seemed to grow darker still, as if the very shadows were drawing closer to him. Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling, but his feet wouldn't obey him. His body felt like it was rooted to the spot, every instinct telling him to run, to escape. But he couldn't move. His legs refused to work. The face in the shadows twisted, its features elongating as if trying to stretch toward him. It was too much. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his vision blurred with fear. He finally broke free from the paralysis and bolted toward the door, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. The scraping noise followed him, growing louder, closer. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he grabbed the handle and twisted. But it wouldn't open. The door was locked. His breath came in ragged gasps now, his entire body trembling with a mix of fear and exhaustion. He yanked at the door again, panic rising in his throat. The shadows seemed to press against him, growing thicker, more oppressive. He slammed his shoulder into the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of the scraping grew louder. And then, just as his mind was about to shatter from the horror of it all, a voice broke through the chaos. A low, guttural whisper, right behind him. "You can't leave." Ethan's heart was hammering in his chest as he spun around, desperate to escape the voice that had whispered so chillingly behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his throat tight, and his limbs felt as though they were made of lead. The shadows around him seemed to bend and twist, drawing closer, pressing in from all sides. It was as though the room itself had become a living, breathing entity, suffocating him with its oppressive darkness. His hand gripped the doorknob harder, his knuckles white with the strain, but the door remained firmly locked, mocking him. There was no way out. No way to escape whatever presence was lurking in the shadows. The voice, low and guttural, echoed in his mind, repeating its words over and over again. "You can't leave." It wasn't a simple statement. It was a command, a sentence handed down from some unfathomable source, one that chilled him to the bone. His body was trembling now, his senses on high alert, every instinct screaming at him to run. But where could he go? The mall, once just a place of concrete and glass, now felt like a labyrinth, its walls closing in on him, the corridors twisting into an endless maze that led only to more darkness, more terror. The flashlight in his hand trembled as he shone it in all directions, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness like a blade. His eyes darted frantically across the room, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of life. The only sound was the pounding of his own heart, the heavy, ragged breaths that echoed in his ears. Yet, despite the emptiness around him, despite the stillness, Ethan could feel it, something watching him. Something was there, just out of sight, its presence hanging in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on him from all sides. The cold, frigid air had seeped into his bones, making his teeth chatter, and a shiver ran down his spine. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped drastically, the chill so sharp it felt like it was cutting through his skin. His body shook uncontrollably, his breath clouding in the air before him, but it wasn't just the cold that made him tremble. It was the fear. The fear that had been building inside him ever since he had first stepped into the mall, creeping slowly at first, but now consuming him, engulfing him completely. His mind felt like it was unraveling, each thought slipping through his fingers like sand. Suddenly, the faintest sound broke through the silence. A low, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. Ethan froze, his eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. He spun around, shining his flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. The room was still. Silent. The darkness felt even deeper now, more oppressive. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive, moving, shifting, creeping closer with every passing second. He took a step back, his pulse racing, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get out, but his legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by some invisible force. The scraping sound grew louder, closer now, and Ethan's fear reached a fever pitch. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no rational explanation. No logical reason for any of this. He could feel his sanity beginning to slip away, piece by piece. The shadows seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing inward, and for a moment he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to tell himself that this was just a nightmare, that none of this was real. But deep down he knew the truth. This was real. And whatever was in that room with him wasn't human. Another sound, closer now, unmistakable. A thud. A heavy, solid thud, like something large and heavy had dropped to the floor. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering before it cut out completely. Darkness engulfed him, absolute and suffocating. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it working again. His hands shook so badly that it felt like he was trying to hold onto a lifeline, but his grip was slipping, his fingers too numb, too frozen to function properly. The darkness closed in, and for the briefest moment, it felt like he was drowning in it. Then, with a soft click, the flashlight came back to life. The beam sliced through the darkness once more, illuminating the room, but the shadows remained. They weren't just in the corners now, they were everywhere. The walls seemed to shift and bend, the space around him warping, twisting. It was like the room itself had become alive, its geometry breaking down, its reality bending, just like his mind. He felt as though he were trapped in some kind of nightmare, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from, a nightmare that had taken on a life of its own. The scraping sound was now unmistakable, coming from behind him, closer with every passing second. Ethan dared not turn around. His body was frozen in place, his legs trembling beneath him. The fear was overwhelming, flooding his senses, drowning out all thought. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His body refused to cooperate, locked in a state of paralysis as the noise grew louder and louder, until it felt as though it was all around him, closing in from every direction. And then there it was. A shape, emerging from the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, a dark figure against the blackness. But as it moved closer, Ethan could make out the details. Its shape was unnatural, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. It wasn't human, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was something far worse, something far older. It had no face, no recognizable features, just a gaping void where its eyes should have been. Its limbs were long and thin, twisted in ways that defied natural movement. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were savoring every step, every moment of Ethan's terror. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribcage, his body finally finding the strength to react. His legs moved, but they felt as if they were made of stone. He stumbled back, his body in full flight mode, but his mind was a blur, unable to process what he was seeing. The figure was getting closer, and Ethan's throat constricted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His entire body screamed for him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figure was everywhere, its presence filling the room, its unnatural movements blocking every exit, every escape route. Ethan finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled cry, a sound that barely resembled anything human. "No!" he yelled, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Stay away from me!" His hands shook as he reached for anything he could find. A chair, a broken piece of furniture, anything to defend himself, but there was nothing. Nothing but the figure, slowly advancing, its hollow, faceless head tilting slightly, as though it was studying him, savoring his fear. With a final burst of energy, Ethan turned and bolted for the door again, his hand reaching for the handle, praying, pleading for it to open. But the door remained locked, and the sound of the figure's dragging, scraping movement grew louder, closer, until it was right behind him. He could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze, even though he knew it had no eyes. The darkness, thick and suffocating, closed in around him, and he could no longer tell where the shadows ended and where the figure began. Ethan's body was trembling violently now, each breath sharp and ragged as the thing behind him drew closer, its dragging, scraping footsteps echoing like a death knell in the stifling air. Every instinct screamed for him to move, to get away from it, but his body seemed to have betrayed him. His feet felt as if they were anchored to the cold floor, rooted by some unseen force, as if the very building was holding him in place, refusing to let him leave. His mind, however, was not paralyzed. It raced, spinning with 1,000 thoughts and no clear answer. This couldn't be happening. There had to be an explanation, something that made sense, yet all his attempts to rationalize the nightmare before him felt hollow, like trying to grasp at smoke. The shadow inched forward, its grotesque shape looming ever closer, its presence suffocating the air. Ethan's flashlight, which had grown weaker with every passing minute, flickered again. The beam struggled to hold its ground, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. In those fleeting moments of light, he could see the twisted form of the creature, its impossibly long limbs moving with a fluidity that defied the laws of nature, as though its joints were made of something far more sinister than bone and muscle. The sound it made as it dragged itself toward him sent a wave of ice through his veins, like nails scraping on a chalkboard, only slower, deliberate, each movement drawn out, punctuating the dread that filled the room. Ethan's heart hammered against his chest, each beat a reminder of how fragile his grip on reality had become. The fear was overwhelming now, a suffocating tide that threatened to pull him under. He could feel the walls of the room closing in on him, the oppressive darkness pressing against him from every side, smothering him. The cold was like an icy grip on his spine, seeping into his bones, freezing him in place. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the freezing chill that filled the air. His mouth went dry, his throat tight, as he struggled to keep his breath steady, to stop his hands from shaking. The creature continued its slow, agonizing approach, and Ethan's mind screamed for him to act. But what could he do? The door was still locked, his flashlight was flickering and weak, and the thing in the shadows was moving closer with every passing second. He had to get out. He had to run. But the cold terror that had taken hold of him was paralyzing. Every part of him wanted to flee, to escape, but his legs felt as though they had been turned to stone, heavy and uncooperative. The creature's movements seemed to echo in his head, each scrape sending ripples of panic through his chest, like a countdown to something horrible. As the figure drew near, Ethan could see the full extent of its form. It was humanoid in shape, but that was where any resemblance to a human being ended. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body unnervingly thin, as if it had been starved for years. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over the bone, the texture of its flesh like something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for far too long. Its head was disproportionately large, its features grotesquely stretched, like some horrible caricature of humanity. But it had no face, just an empty, gaping void where its eyes should have been, like a mask of darkness that swallowed all light. Ethan's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. There was no logical explanation for this thing, no reason why it should be here. It wasn't human, it wasn't anything he had ever encountered before. It was something far older, far darker, something that should not exist. And yet, here it was, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, its empty gaze fixed firmly on him, even though it had no eyes. A sudden jolt of movement surged through Ethan, like a shockwave that sent him stumbling forward. His feet finally obeyed, and he darted toward the door once more, his hand reaching for the handle, desperate to escape. But again, the door remained locked. He pulled at it with all his strength, his pulse racing, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. It wouldn't open. The room had become a prison, and the thing behind him was the warden, its presence an inescapable, unyielding force. He turned back to face it, his eyes wide with terror, his body trembling uncontrollably. The creature was closer now, so close that he could feel the air grow even colder as it moved toward him. The flashlight in his hand flickered one last time before it sputtered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he thought the sound might drown out everything else. The silence that followed was deafening, an unnerving, suffocating quiet that pressed in on him from all sides. He could no longer see the creature, but he could feel its presence, its cold, malevolent energy filling the room. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each more panicked than the last. What was this thing? What did it want? Why was it here? And why couldn't he escape? His legs felt weak, his stomach a churning pit of dread. He had to do something. Anything. But the fear was too much, too overwhelming. He was trapped. Trapped in the dark, with something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't exist, something that was far beyond his understanding. He stumbled backward, his feet kicking against something. A chair, perhaps, or a broken piece of furniture, but he barely noticed. His eyes were wide, his gaze fixed on the space in front of him, where the creature had once stood. But now it was gone. There was nothing. Just darkness. The oppressive, suffocating darkness that seemed to breathe around him, closing in, tightening its grip. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he strained his eyes, trying to make out any shape, any movement. But there was nothing. The air was still. The scraping sound had stopped. The creature had vanished, but its presence lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The room felt even colder now, as though the very temperature had dropped several degrees, the chill settling deep into his bones. His skin was clammy, his palms slick with sweat. He couldn't think, couldn't focus. The fear was too much. It was like a weight, pressing on his chest, suffocating him, making it impossible to breathe, to think, to do anything. Ethan stumbled back again, his hands desperately searching for anything to steady himself. His fingers brushed against the cold, rough texture of a wall, and he pressed his back against it, trying to steady himself. The room felt endless now, the walls stretching away into the darkness. The lights, flickering and dimming, gave him no comfort. It was like the very walls of the building were alive and closing in around him, trapping him inside. He felt a cold breath against his neck, a slow, excruciatingly quiet breath that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His entire body went rigid, his blood running cold. The thing was still there. It had never left. It was watching him, waiting, just beyond the reach of his senses, its presence so overwhelming that he could almost taste it in the air. He felt it crawling under his skin, seeping into his thoughts, poisoning his mind. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling so violently that he could no longer hold onto the wall. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his body unable to keep up with the terror that had taken hold of him. The fear was too great. It felt like drowning in an ocean of darkness, with no air, no hope, no escape. The creature wasn't just in the room with him, it was inside his mind, inside his very soul, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. And then it spoke again. The voice was like a whisper in the back of his mind, a low, guttural growl that sent a jolt of ice through his spine. "You will never leave," it rasped, each word like a blade scraping against his thoughts. Ethan's chest heaved as the words echoed in his mind, the sinister whisper lingering like a poison, curling around his thoughts. "You will never leave." The voice was cold, detached, as though it were nothing more than an inescapable truth. His body shook violently as the fear clawed at him from within, suffocating him, eating away at the remnants of his sanity. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to escape, but where could he run? Where could he hide when the very walls of the room seemed to close in around him like a prison built from shadows and darkness? The creature had stopped moving, but Ethan could feel it. Its presence was still there, its weight in the air, a dark, oppressive force that filled the space like smoke. He could not see it, but he knew it was there, lurking just out of view, waiting, watching. His mind was spiraling now, every thought a frantic race to comprehend what was happening, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. But there was no sense to be made. It wasn't just the creature. It was the building itself. The mall, once so familiar, had transformed into something alien, something that had twisted beyond recognition. The floor beneath him seemed unstable, the walls too close, the air too thick. It was as if the very structure of the place had turned against him. His hands were trembling uncontrollably as he reached for the flashlight again, the beam weak and wavering. The faint light did little to pierce the darkness. It only made the shadows deeper, more suffocating. He swung the beam around, hoping to catch sight of something, anything that could explain this madness, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for him and the creeping dread that surrounded him. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him, its weight unbearable. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he shifted, every movement feeling like a loud, unmistakable signal to whatever was out there in the dark. He felt its eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. The emptiness was alive with malevolence, like 1,000 invisible eyes watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, his mind struggling to keep up with the panic that was slowly taking over. His thoughts were a blur, a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion, unable to form any coherent plan of action. The darkness felt like it was closing in, the shadows shifting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. Ethan could hear the faintest sound, a breath, perhaps, or the scrape of something dragging across the floor. His eyes snapped to the corner of the room, the beam of his flashlight illuminating nothing but empty space. His heart pounded in his chest, the beat echoing in his ears like a drum, drowning out everything else. He couldn't keep his focus. The fear was too much, too overwhelming. His entire body screamed at him to escape, but every step felt like it took him deeper into the nightmare. There was no way out. The mall had become a labyrinth, its corridors twisting, its walls shifting, its very existence bending under the weight of something unnatural. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a loud, bone-chilling crack, followed by a slow, deliberate thud. Ethan whipped around, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he tried to locate the source. The sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. His pulse quickened as he swung the beam toward the noise, but again, there was nothing. The room remained empty, its oppressive silence almost suffocating. His mind was reeling, spinning with questions, trying desperately to understand what was happening, but the answers refused to come. He couldn't think straight. The fear had clouded his thoughts, leaving him in a state of panic, unable to focus, unable to find a way out. The scraping noise returned, louder this time, more insistent. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as he realized the sound was coming from all around him. It was as if the very walls were alive, their surfaces shifting and scraping against each other. He felt the walls closing in, felt the air thickening, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. His heart was racing now, a wild, frantic rhythm that echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. He had to get out. He had to leave, but the building had become a maze, and every hallway led him back to the same place, to the same suffocating darkness. With a sense of desperation, Ethan took a step forward, but the scraping sound intensified, becoming a deafening roar in his ears. It was everywhere now, behind him, beside him, in front of him. He turned frantically, swinging the flashlight around, but the beam couldn't pierce the overwhelming darkness. It felt like the shadows were closing in on him from all directions, their presence thick and suffocating. His legs were trembling, his body on the edge of collapse, but still he moved one step after another, toward the door. The door was his only chance. The door was his only way out. His hand reached for the handle, but before he could grasp it, the air grew even colder, a sudden, biting chill that seemed to freeze the very breath in his lungs. His fingers froze, locked in place on the cold metal of the door handle. The cold was unbearable now, so sharp and fierce it felt as if his skin was being torn apart. His vision blurred as the temperature dropped further, the room spinning as if the very space around him was warping, shifting in unnatural ways. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving like living things, stretching and twisting, reaching toward him. His breath was coming in shallow gasps now, each exhale a visible cloud in the frigid air. Then, the scraping noise stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the deafening silence. Ethan stood frozen, his hands still gripping the door handle, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see the creature anymore, but he could feel it, its presence pressing against him, filling the room with an unspoken threat. The darkness felt alive, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His body was trembling uncontrollably, his legs weak and unsteady, but he refused to let go of the door handle. It was the only thing he could hold on to, the only thing that stood between him and whatever was lurking in the shadows. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. It was as if the world had stopped, suspended in time, leaving Ethan alone in the dark with the creature and the oppressive weight of the fear that surrounded him. His mind felt like it was about to snap, the pressure mounting, suffocating him. He could feel the walls closing in, the shadows crawling closer, their cold fingers reaching for him. And then, just as the silence seemed to reach its peak, the scraping noise returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the sound of something moving, it was the sound of something watching him, something waiting. It was a sound filled with malice, with a hunger that chilled him to the core. The door handle rattled in his hand, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way through. Ethan pulled back, his heart pounding in his chest as he stumbled away from the door. His mind was spinning now, unable to grasp what was real and what was just the product of his fear. He turned toward the walls, toward the shadows, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness and the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. But then, a sound, a deep, guttural growl, cut through the silence, and Ethan froze. The growl was low, almost primal, like something that had been hidden in the depths of the earth for centuries. It was a sound that spoke of hunger, of malice, of something ancient and terrifying. And it was coming from behind him. He turned slowly, his heart in his throat, and there it was. The figure. The creature. It stood there, just at the edge of the darkness, its face, or lack of one, frozen in a grotesque expression of pure, unrelenting hunger. Its empty eyes were fixed on him, its twisted limbs stretching toward him with unnatural grace. Ethan's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs refused to cooperate. The fear had paralyzed him. The creature had him cornered, and there was nowhere left to go. Ethan's breath became shallow, his body on the verge of collapse as the creature took a slow, deliberate step forward. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last, filling his ears with a deafening rhythm that drowned out everything else. The darkness around him was no longer just an absence of light. It had become something tangible, something that pressed in from every side, a suffocating force that seemed to weigh on him, dragging him deeper into panic. The creature's presence was an overwhelming pressure, a heavy weight that pushed against him, suffocating him with the fear that it would never stop, never let him go. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt like stone, unmoving, unresponsive, frozen in place by a terror so deep it consumed every thought. The figure before him was no longer just a shape. It was a nightmare made flesh, its twisted form standing before him in the dim light of his flickering flashlight. It was everything his mind couldn't comprehend, everything that defied the laws of nature. The creature's limbs were impossibly long, its joints contorted in grotesque angles, each movement like something from a broken, twisted dream. Its skin was stretched too tightly, pale and unnatural, like a thin layer of parchment stretched over fragile bone. And its face, or the absence of one, was the most horrifying aspect of all. It was as though it had been hollowed out, its features erased, leaving only an empty void where eyes should have been, a dark, gaping space that seemed to swallow the very light around it. Ethan's eyes were wide with terror, unable to look away, even though every instinct told him to run, to turn his back and flee. But there was nowhere to go. The walls had shifted, the corridors warped, and the space around him seemed to twist in on itself. No matter how fast he moved, no matter how many times he ran, he always ended up back here, facing the same nightmare, the same impossible creature. His mind was unraveling, unable to grasp the reality of the situation. The world around him felt like it was slipping through his fingers, each moment fading into the next without any sense of control. His throat was dry, his breath coming in short gasps as he stared at the creature. Its presence was all-consuming, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Every muscle in his body was screaming for him to fight, to find some way to push back against the terror that gripped him. But there was nothing he could do. The creature was too powerful, too ancient. It was something from a world beyond his understanding, something that had been waiting for him, watching him, for far longer than he could imagine. It wasn't just in the room with him. It was in his mind, its dark influence creeping into his thoughts, twisting them, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The air around him grew colder still, the temperature dropping so suddenly that it felt as though the very atmosphere had turned to ice. His breath formed visible clouds in the air, each exhale sharp and painful. The chill seeped into his bones, making every movement feel sluggish, every action weighed down by the freezing cold that pressed against him like an invisible force. The creature's hollow gaze seemed to pierce through him, its presence an overwhelming pressure that felt like it was pulling the very life from him. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the faintest sound of the creature's movement, its slow, deliberate steps echoing in the stillness. Ethan's body trembled uncontrollably, his legs unsteady beneath him as he took a hesitant step back. But the creature didn't move, didn't chase him. It simply stood there, watching, waiting, its empty face fixed on him with an unnerving stillness. The room seemed to stretch and contract, the walls closing in around him, making the space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, and Ethan's mind was on the edge of breaking. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and there was no escape. He opened his mouth to scream, to call out, but no sound came. His throat was dry, tight, and the words were trapped inside, as though something were choking him from the inside. His body was moving on its own now, his legs carrying him backward, step by agonizing step. He couldn't stop himself, couldn't control the frantic panic that was slowly taking over his every thought. The creature remained silent, still, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, those empty, soulless voids that seemed to consume everything they touched. It was as though the creature was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The flashlight in his hand flickered again, its beam weak and erratic, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. He barely noticed it, his focus entirely consumed by the creature. Every muscle in his body was tense, locked in a state of paralysis. His legs were shaking so violently that he was sure he would collapse at any moment. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. The creature was still watching, still waiting, and Ethan knew that he couldn't afford to stop moving. If he did, it would be over. He stumbled back once more, his feet catching on something, debris perhaps, sending him crashing to the floor with a sharp, painful thud. His breath left his chest in a rush, the impact knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, everything went black, and he felt the crushing weight of the darkness pressing down on him. His heart raced in his chest, each beat pounding louder in his ears, each breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, each moment slipping further away, becoming a blur of terror and confusion. When his vision cleared, the creature was still there. Still standing. Still watching. The room felt even colder now, the chill settling deep into his bones. His mind reeled with panic, his thoughts scattered in 100 different directions. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. But nothing made sense anymore. The walls were closing in. The shadows were growing thicker. The creature was waiting, and it was getting closer with every passing second. Ethan forced himself to his feet, his body protesting with each movement, his legs shaking with fear and exhaustion. His flashlight was still clutched tightly in his hand, though it flickered in and out of light, offering no real guidance in the dark. The weight of the creature's presence was crushing, the very air around him heavy with malevolence. He could feel it closing in on him, could feel the weight of its gaze pressing against him, suffocating him. It was no longer just in the room. It was inside him, its darkness poisoning his every thought, feeding on his terror. He turned his back on the creature, not daring to look at it again, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of escape. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of empty space, the shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own. The walls felt like they were pressing in on him, the air growing thinner with every breath he took. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into his very soul, freezing his heart, making it impossible to think, to focus. His mind was slipping. His grip on reality was slipping. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the door again, his fingers barely able to grasp the cold, metal handle. He pulled at it desperately, but once again, the door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, yanked it with all his strength, but it remained locked, the metal giving nothing. His body sagged against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pressed his forehead against the cold surface. The fear was all-consuming, drowning him, suffocating him, and there was no way out. No escape from the creature that waited in the shadows, no escape from the nightmare that had become his reality. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the air, and Ethan's spine went rigid. The sound was almost a vibration, deep and primal, the kind of noise that made his blood run cold. It was coming from behind him. He knew it without even having to turn around. The growl was followed by a sharp, twisting noise, like something scraping against metal, a sound that made his stomach churn with revulsion. The creature was getting closer. It was close enough now that he could feel the air shift, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to swallow the very light around him. Ethan's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor once more, his mind reeling, his heart pounding. There was nothing left. No way to escape. No way to fight back. The darkness had consumed him, and the creature was waiting to finish what it had started. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Ethan's shallow breaths, each one growing more desperate as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the overwhelming fear that gripped him, a fear that had long since surpassed any logic, any rational thought. It was raw, primal, a fear that was felt in the very marrow of his bones, a terror that had taken root in his mind, growing with each passing second. His fingers trembled, clinging to the cold metal of the door handle as though it were his only lifeline, his last chance to escape. The darkness around him seemed to close in tighter, the air growing thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The creature was still there, somewhere in the shadows, and he could feel its presence like a weight on his soul, an invisible force that pulled at him, kept him tethered to this nightmare. He didn't dare look back. His mind refused to let him face it, but he could feel its eyes on him, though they were empty, hollow. The sensation of being watched was almost tangible, a steady, unrelenting pressure that made his skin crawl, his hair stand on end. With every passing moment, his thoughts grew more frantic, more disjointed. How had he ended up here? How had everything gone so horribly wrong? He had been just another security guard, trying to make it through the night shift in a mall that should have been as mundane as any other. But now, everything had changed. The walls had shifted. The darkness had come alive. The very air felt different, twisted in ways he couldn't comprehend. And the creature, it had always been there, lurking just beyond his grasp, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. His hands shook as he slowly let go of the door handle, the coldness of it biting into his skin. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to get away, but there was no place to go. The building was no longer just a building. It was a maze, a prison. He had no way of knowing which way to turn, which direction to flee. Every hallway, every door, every corner had become an uncharted territory, a dead end leading him back to the same oppressive darkness. And the creature was always there, waiting. Watching. Ethan stumbled back, his legs giving way as the fear and exhaustion combined into an overwhelming tidal wave. His back hit the wall with a sharp crack, the impact jarring his spine and causing a wave of pain to shoot through him. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat, but it wasn't just the physical pain that was paralyzing him, it was the terror, the fear that had taken hold of his mind. The fear that told him there was no escape. The fear that told him he was already trapped. The scraping sound, that low, grating noise, echoed in the room again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the walls shifting. It was something else. Something closer. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, his breath coming faster, his chest tightening. He didn't know where it was coming from. His flashlight flickered once more, casting an erratic beam of light that danced across the room, but it didn't reveal anything. No creature. No shadow. Just the darkness, oppressive and thick, filling the space with a suffocating weight. His eyes flickered toward the hallway, the one he had walked down so many times before. It looked different now, narrower, darker, the shadows creeping along the walls as if they were alive, reaching out to pull him in. There was no escape in that direction. No safety. The mall, which had once been so familiar, had become something alien, unrecognizable. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, mixed with a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. It smelled like something ancient, like something that had been forgotten for far too long. He turned his gaze back to the door. It was still locked. His mind raced for a solution, but every thought felt clouded, like trying to see through a fog that wouldn't lift. He could hear the scraping again, louder now, closer. The thing was moving, inching its way toward him. He could feel its presence, could almost hear its ragged breathing, its hunger, its anticipation. The air around him grew colder still, the chill biting into his skin, and his breath formed clouds in front of him, the temperature dropping so rapidly it felt as if the very air was freezing. A sudden noise, a door creaking open, slow and deliberate, cut through the stillness, and Ethan's head whipped toward it. The sound came from the far end of the hallway, a deep, hollow groan that reverberated through the walls. His heart skipped a beat. Was it the creature? Was it coming for him? The door creaked again, but this time there was no mistaking it. The thing was behind him.